You are listening to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Deborah Carr, Director of the Center of Innovation in Social Science and ANS Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Boston University Arts and Sciences, as our distinguished guest on today's podcast. Dr. Deborah is a distinguished life course sociologist whose research explores the social factors that shape health and well-being across the lifespan, particularly in later life. Using survey data and quantitative methods, she examines topics such as inequality in old age, death and dying, bereavement, family relationship over the life course, and the stigma associated with health conditions, including obesity and disability. Dr. Ka is the author or editor of more than 120 scholarly articles, book chapters, and several influential books, including Aging in America, published by University of California Press, and Worried Sick, How Stress Hurts Us and How to Bounce Back by Rutgers University Press. She has also co-authored widely used textbooks such as Introduction to Sociology, Essentials of Sociology, and the Art and Sciences of Social Research, all published by W. Norton. Her book Golden Years, Social Inequality in Later Life, Rochelle Sage in 2019, received the 2020 Richard Kelly's Innovative Publication Award from the Genderinequality Society of America. She is also the co-editor of the Handbook of Aging and the Social Sciences 9th edition. Her research has been supported by the leading institutions, including the National Institutes of Health, the RRF Foundation on Aging, the Templeton Foundation, and Burkhardt Foundation, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Dr. Deborah currently serves as Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Health and Social Behavior and is the Principal Investigator of the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth 1979. She previously served as the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Gerontology, Social Sciences. She has held leadership positions, including serving on the board of directors of the Population Association of America and chairing the Aging and Life Course and Medical Sociology sections of the American Sociological Association. She is the fellow of the Gerontological Society of America, a member of the Sociological Research Association, and recipient of the 2020 Matilda White Riley Distinguished Scholar Award and the 2023 Outstanding Mentorship Award from the ASS Aging and Life Course section. In 2024, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her research and commentaries have been featured in major media outlets such as the New York Times, USA Today, CNN, Los Angeles Times, The Conversation, and PBS programs, including Story in the Public Sphere, and to the contrary, as well as podcasts such as the New Books Network. In this episode, Dr. Deborah Carr explores her research, do social security benefit rules, perpetuate marital status, and gender inequalities. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah Carr to the podcast. Dr. Deborah, thank you for graciously accepting our invitation. It's an honor and privilege to have you with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure to join you today.
Professor, what inspired you to examine how social security benefit rules intersect with marital status and gender, and what gap in the existing research were you aiming to fill?
Sure. Well, I've always been interested in economic inequality in old age, and specifically, why are some people living in poverty and others are having these wonderful retirements where they have plenty of money? And we know that in the United States, Social Security is one of the most successful programs in policy history, right? It provides a floor so that no older adults are living really in deep poverty. But even though it brings up everybody, it doesn't eliminate disparities, right? We still see a huge gap in who lives well and who doesn't. And women are much more likely than men to be impoverished in old age. It's the classic feminization of poverty. And a lot of the research focuses on work and education, but I thought we really needed a much closer attention to family roles and specifically sacrifices that women make for their families that take them out of the labor force. Women who are married who make workplace sacrifices to care for their family still have their husband's income to live on when they're married, and then they might have their husband's Social Security to live on in later life. But we have rising numbers of older adults in the United States who are not married in old age, despite the stereotype of people having very stable romantic unions. That's not the case. We have ever rising numbers of divorced older adults in the United States. And in reading more about why do people who were divorced earlier in life, why do they have such high rates of poverty? I read the Social Security rules very carefully, and I saw that divorced people are indeed penalized. That a divorced person, even if it was a woman who worked to support her husband's business and they were married for years, she wouldn't get her husband's Social Security benefits after that marriage ended, even if she sacrificed her own career for him. And it's a kind of a fine grained distinction, but people can only get their former spouse's Social Security worker benefit if they were married 10 or more years. And then on top of that, they get only 50%. And so that policy detail that I hadn't been previously aware of until I started doing this project struck me as not only unfair, but really out of touch with the way older adult family lives look in the 21st century.
Professor, your study uses the Wynne-Cosin longitudinal study, which tracks individuals over several decades. What makes this dataset particularly powerful for exploring cumulative advantages across the life course?
Yes, that's right. The recent study I did is based on a data set called the Wisconsin Longitudinal Study. And this is a really interesting study. It actually began in 1957, and it began as a survey of every high school senior in the state of Wisconsin. And see, so we have really detailed information on their childhood, their schooling, what kind of family background they had, but it's been following them forward since 1957, now through their 80s. And there are some issues with using the data set. It's not nationally representative. It's older white adults from Wisconsin who graduated high school. But the strength is we know about their entire lives. And that's critical because the study that I did, we really needed to know about every marriage they've had in life, how long each of those marriages lasted. In the case of widowhood, I needed to know how old they were when their marriage ended, because as I'll say a little bit more later in our conversation, widowed people also face some disadvantages in terms of Social Security benefits based on whether they were widowed older versus younger. And so the data demands essentially for this project were very high. I needed to know about their whole lives, their whole family lives and their work lives. And the WLS is a data set that has just really impeccable life course data. So it was ideally suited to this particular project. And another reason why I think it's well suited is that whatever disadvantages we see among white adults are going to be even more exacerbated for Black individuals, just given a history of systemic racism in the United States. And so, whatever problems that, with aging that I see in my WLS study will be an understatement of what the problems look like at a national level, given that even the poorest person in the WLS sample still had white racial privilege on their side.
Professor, the paper finds that divorced women far worse across all economic outcomes in later life. Could you unpack why the structure of Social Security benefits disadvantages this group so sharply?
Yes, that was one of the main findings of the paper. And in fact, there's a very large literature showing that divorce, and especially women who are divorced, fare far worse economically than their married counterparts and even their never married or widowed counterparts. And so, just to elaborate a bit on what we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, back 50, 60 years ago, the main way that a marriage ended was through widowhood, through the death of one spouse. That's no longer the case today. We had rising rates of divorce through the 1970s and 80s. So, lots of people who divorced in their 30s or 40s are still divorced when they're an older person, especially women who are much less likely to remarry relative to a man who gets divorced in his 30s and 40s. But alongside that, since about 1990, we've had another really marked change, which is the rise in gray divorce. So we have more and more people getting divorced in their 50s. So we have a really large population of divorced older adults and more women than men because the men are more likely to remarry very quickly. And so we have this large population. I think that's why it's so important to focus on. But I also saw that widowed women fared far worse financially than divorced men. than widowed women and even never married women. So, what is it among all these unmarried women that made divorce so disadvantageous? And I think one reason is the structure of the Social Security benefits. Again, that for women who were widowed, let's say a woman who was widowed didn't earn that much in her own life. She could kind of forsake her own worker benefit and absorb 100% of her husband's. A widowed woman would, sorry, a divorced woman would not have that same opportunity. She would only get half of the husband's benefit. And then only if it was a long term marriage. And these are real obstacles. And I think one reason it's so problematic is that the assumption is, well, a divorced woman's not entitled to 100% of her husband's Social Security benefit because they didn't stay married. But we all know of those cases whereby a marriage ended and a woman is left really without many resources because she dedicated her time and her energy to children and to supporting her husband's career. She didn't have those skills that she could bring back to the labor force to get a high paying job in a good pension. And so it really is this kind of perfect storm of multiple challenges facing women of divorce, particularly in this generation for whom, they tended to prioritize children and family rather than careers, especially when they were in the peak of their married years. So they really do suffer when that relationship ends.
Professor, you describe marriage as an institution of economically privileged persons. How has this dynamic evolved over time, and how does it shape who benefits most from social security today?
Great, that's a great question. And another of the motivating factors behind this project was the observation that over the past 40 to 50 years, marriage has become an institution of economic privilege. And that speaks to this sociological theme of kind of cumulative disadvantage. Today, people who marry are economically better off and have better education and better health than their counterparts who don't marry. They're also better off than their counterparts whose marriages end. So Social Security benefits married people who already have the most advantages. And this is a pretty new phenomenon, right? In the old days, marriage was pretty universal. Today, it takes money to marry. And there's also a factor whereby people are very selective in who they marry. If someone has bad health, if someone has poor economic prospects, they're less likely to marry, and that's something that's fairly new. In the old days, the women who never married were these highly educated women who could go on their own. Today, if you look at the demographic characteristics of those who haven't married, it is those who face economic and health disadvantages. Likewise, people who divorce, it's not just that divorce causes poverty, like we've talked about. Economic disadvantage actually increases the likelihood that someone becomes divorced in the first place. Because what is the leading causes of divorce? One are financial strains, right? Another is health problems, right? And we know that poverty can destabilize a marriage. It can lead to squabbles. It can lead to debates about child rearing. It can lead to coping mechanisms like substance use that aren't terribly healthy. So as you can see, it's kind of like the rolling stone collecting moss, this cumulative disadvantage that people with disadvantage in the first place are more likely to divorce, and then divorce exacerbates that even further. And the Social Security rules are yet another force kind of leading to that widening bifurcation between the haves and have nots on the basis of marital status.
Professor, the study differentiates between those widowed before and after age 65. What key insights emerge from this distinction, and what does it reveal about the timings of life events and economic vulnerability?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've been talking about divorce thus far, but I think we really need to keep an eye on what's happening with widowed people, those older adults, typically women whose spouse dies, and that's how the union ends. There's also this kind of cumulative disadvantage there because we know that mortality is linked to socioeconomic status. Those people with more economic adversities are more likely to die, meaning their spouse is more likely to be widowed. So we have that selective process happening. But another issue is that Social Security benefits, bringing it back to those rules, people who collect their late spouse's benefit. So if a woman is widowed, she can choose to get either her late husband's worker benefit or her own worker benefit if she had a career. They usually choose whichever is higher. right? And given gender gaps in pay, often the husband's is higher. But now this is where it gets a little bit complicated. If you claim early, and people know that if you're a worker who claims early, you get a lower cut of your benefit. The same is true for widowed people. And so, which widows are the ones claiming their husband's benefit at a younger age, meaning before age 65, before 62? Those again who had the most economic disadvantage to start with because they were prematurely widowed. So, again, economic challenges lead to them being widowed prematurely. Then they claim the benefit, but they get a percentage deduction kind of for every year before their full benefit age. And so that's yet another case whereby those who are already disadvantaged are further disadvantaged by the structure of the benefits.
Professor, never married men also appear to face economic insecurity, though in different ways. How do gender norms and lifetime work patterns intersect with these findings?
Yeah, one of the most surprising findings that came out of this research project, not just the one recent publication that you and I are talking about now, but another related publication we had about a year ago, was that men who have never married, who are admittedly a small group, it's about 7% of older adults today. It goes up to about 10% for the younger cohorts coming through, for the Gen X and the millennials. But these men who had never married had dramatically higher rates of poverty relative to married men and relative to widowed and divorced men. And in doing this project, we looked at every possible explanation that we could find. We controlled for what occupations they had. Perhaps they were clergy. We tried to control for sexual orientation, given that we know that homophobia and heterosexism are real. That didn't explain it. We actually control for things like physical attractiveness, personality, and we even when we control for all these potential explanations, that pattern still held that men who had never married were had such higher rates of poverty. And we think there are a couple of reasons for that. I think one is that never married people, especially those who've been, never married or single their whole life, they never achieved economies of scale. And so they had to pay a lot. Just think if your house, you have one income and you alone pay for the food and the electricity and the vacations, you can't spread those costs. So that's one factor. The other is there is a phenomenon that is attributed to a researcher named Bella DePaulo called singleism. And that is that never married people face discrimination, right? We tend to think, oh, is there something odd about them? Is there something wrong about them? There's a perception in the workplace, and there's a lot of data on this, that men who are unmarried are viewed as less responsible. So the promotions go to their colleague who's married. There are other ways that singlehood can undermine men's work prospects. One is that in traditional older adult households, a husband could succeed at work because he had a wife who could hold the dinner parties and could help on the home front and really bolster the man's career. A never married man who doesn't have a spouse or partner doesn't have that same set of resources. So even though we couldn't test for every possible explanation because it wasn't in our data set, we really tried to understand why that is. And we think it's this whole confluence of factors having to do with economies of scale, singleism, and then just the benefits that are provided by a spouse to help people, especially men, succeed in the workforce for this generation of older adults.
Professor, given that social security was designed in a very different era, how do current rules fail to reflect the diversity of family structures and work histories seen today?
Yeah. Social Security rules really were designed for another era. And it's not for a lack of desire to help people, right? Social Security case first started in the 1930s, and it was a way that women who really had no career options could be supported after their husbands died. It was based on the assumption that a man did the earnings and the woman stayed home. And so when that man died, the widow really was entitled to benefits. And that is, in fact, still true. But what wasn't considered back then was one, that we'd have growing numbers of never married people, again, approaching about 10%. And never married people don't get to choose the bigger option. Married people can choose my benefit from my work or my spouse's benefit from his work, whichever's bigger. A never married person doesn't have that choice. They have just their own. Then, likewise, Divorce, right? Divorce rates rose dramatically in the 70s. Today, it's about a third of all first marriages end in divorce. It's about 50% of marriages overall. That was something that could not have been anticipated in 1935. And so the recognition perhaps then was that divorce is stigmatized. Today is very commonplace. And so I think we need to figure out ways to build in more equity for those who have never married. And then finally, that disparity in terms of age of widowhood, right? Now we recognize that premature widowhood is something that befalls those with the greatest disadvantage. So I think there are things that we need to do to bring it up to speed. Another issue that we haven't talked about is we have more and more older adults today who are cohabiting. They're choosing not to marry. They don't want to commingle their resources. They don't want to remarry because they might lose other pension or other benefits. And there's nothing to be said about those people, right? Cohabiting people in Social Security rules. So some of them could have very long enduring partnerships. So I think we really need to think about what do families look like today, and how might we alter these rules so they reflect the realities of contemporary families.
Professor, your paper suggests potential reforms, such as caregiver credits for periods of unpaid labor. What other policy adjustments might help reduce these structural inequities?
Yeah. I wish I had the perfect answer. I think it's hard to get any kind of policy change, but one that I think could work, as you mentioned, is caregiver credits for periods of unpaid labor, right? For women who are married, they can have long periods of unpaid labor, meaning they leave the workforce, they're at home because they still have that protection from their husband's income. But divorced people don't. And so developing some kind of tax credit whereby those years out of the labor force or with marginal labor where people are contributing to their families, that could be something that counts toward their benefit. And because the benefit is based on a certain number of quarters of paid employment. But I think perhaps factoring in unpaid employment that certainly has a cash value on the open market should be considered. Other things are, again, just taking that 50% that long divorced people get, making it 100%, right? Or alternatively, not capping the marital duration at just 10 years, right? Having it any marriage, similar to the way that widowhood is done. I think that's another way to go. And then finally, something that's more universal, that ensuring that there is sufficient funds or for older adults who are impoverished, right? I think there are things that can be done with Social Security at the bottom of that income distribution, bringing it up a bit more. And, a topic that we hear a lot about today, SNAP. SNAP benefits, which in the United States now are in a very precarious state. Older adults have a quite low rate of uptake for SNAP, even when they're eligible. And I think if their income is low, they would have sufficient money to eat and to provide for themselves.
Professor, from a sociological perspective, how do these financial disparities in older age shape broader issues like well-being, autonomy, and social inclusion among older adults?
Yeah, I think you're onto something really important here. Poverty and low income are correlated with a whole host of detrimental outcomes for older adults. Poverty is associated with depression and anxiety, social isolation for those who can't leave their homes or who don't want to or can't afford meals. A really major consequence is people who are cash poor can't always get their prescription medications because prescription medications are not wholly covered by Medicare. And so maybe they'll cut their pills in half. Maybe they'll take only some of the pills that they're prescribed. Another is that some people can't afford stable housing. And even if they do have stable housing, they sometimes can't afford to keep it at the right temperature, which is a really serious concern for older adults against the backdrop of climate change. They might not turn on their air conditioner. They might not turn on their heat because it's too expensive. So there are just myriad ways that this can affect older adults' physical health and well-being. But then there's that emotional impact, right? People feel very stressed if they can't afford food. They feel very stressed and anxious if they can't make their monthly bills. And so there really is that depression and anxiety that matters. For those who are still married, economic problems, as we referenced earlier, are a real major source of marital strain, right? So even those who are socially connected might find that some of their relationships are strained. And then some of the older adults who are in an economically precarious position might feel that they can't provide for their children. Some of them might have children who are having a rough go or grandchildren who need resources. And if the older people don't have the savings, if they don't have the income, they might feel that they're not really living up to this idealized role of grandparent or parent. So the list really goes on in terms of housing, health, well-being, social integration, self-esteem, diet, and more. And so we really have to keep at the top of mind the fact that money is not just money. It is a tool that older adults can use to live their best possible life. And those who are financially strapped sometimes are making major sacrifices and their well-being suffers in the process.
Dr. Deborah, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Finally, what do you hope policymakers, advocates, or listeners take away from this research? And what next step would you like to see in addressing gender and marital inequalities in retirement security?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think first and foremost, whether it's older adults or younger adults, I think we really need to change the narrative that poverty is a consequence of not wanting to work or not being able to manage one's money. There are real structural factors that keep some people poor and others not. And another really important theme that I write about in Golden Years is that old age poverty does not appear magically on someone's 65th birthday. As we've talked about throughout, being poor in older age often is the end result of a series of adversities and challenges that people have had from really very early years, especially for women who have made these these sacrifices to care for their families. On top of that, we know there's sexism in the labor market. And so I think what we really want to do or need to do to solve late life poverty requires early life interventions, right? It could be educational opportunities for all, making workplaces family friendly. So women who maybe have to engage in childcare can stay in the workforce, even if part time, because they have their jobs protected and they have some support for childcare. Another is whatever we can do to contain housing prices, right? As we referenced earlier, those who are either never married or who have divorced, sometimes they still have to foot 100% of their housing bill, and housing prices and energy costs really have gone through the roof. And so whatever we can do to have more affordable housing. So the solution to late life poverty, again, is not something that we do just for older adults. It's something that happens much earlier so that we can provide people with the skills and environment and resources so that they can age well, even starting from very early life. So early and often, education, health, welfare, and housing all go hand in hand.
Thank you, Dr. Deborah Ka, for sharing your valuable insights on how social security policies shape economic well-being and inequality in later life. Your research offers an important perspective on how thoughtful policy reforms can create a more equitable future for aging populations. It's been a pleasure having you on the Business Talk today. Thank you so much for sharing your insight with us.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.